A soil core comes out of the mud beside the biggest earthen mound in the Americas. It was supposed to hold a flood layer. Proof a city destroyed itself? It doesn't. The layer isn't there. Because 1,000 years ago, in what is now Illinois, a city bigger than London rose out of the floodplain, then emptied out with no invasion, no plague on record, no conqueror. For decades, the answer was simple. They wrecked their own land. The newest dirt says no, and the older wound cuts deeper. For a century, people were told Native Americans never built it. Start with the thing itself, because the thing is almost impossible to believe until you stand at the base of it. Just east of the Mississippi, across the river from modern St. Louis, there is a hill that is not a hill. It is a mound, 100 feet of packed earth, layered, engineered, rising in flat terraces out of a floodplain that has no natural reason to lift like that. It's called Monk's Mound, and its base covers more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that sit for a second. The largest pyramid in Egypt has a rival for sheer footprint sitting in the middle of Illinois, and nobody built it with cut stone or bronze tools or draft animals. They built it by hand, basket by basket, millions of loads of soil carried on human backs and dumped and shaped and packed over and over until it held. And it was not alone. Around it there were roughly 120 mounds, a vast open plaza, neighborhoods. A planned metropolis stretched across the landscape they called the American Bottom. At its height, sometime after the year 1050, the population may have been 10, 15, 20,000 people. Some estimates run higher once you count the suburbs and satellite towns bleeding out into the river valley. That made it the largest city north of the great civilizations of Mexico. Bigger than any city in what would become the United States for the next 600 years. It took until Philadelphia in the 1700s for a North American city to catch up. And here's the first problem. Most Americans have never heard of it. You know the pyramids, you know Rome, you know Machu Picchu, but a city of that scale, in the middle of the continent, and it barely registers in the national memory. That is not an accident. That is a choice that was made slowly by people who found the answer inconvenient. So before we can ask why the city vanished, we have to ask something uglier first. Why it was almost erased on paper. Because the strangest thing about Cahokia isn't how it ended. It's the story that got told about who made it. When settlers and surveyors started spreading across the eastern half of the continent in the 17 and 1800s, they kept running into mounds, thousands of them. Earthworks, embankments, geometric shapes cut into the land across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, enormous, deliberate, old, and the people looking at them refused to believe the answer standing right in front of them. The native peoples who lived in those regions couldn't have built these, the thinking went. They were too sophisticated, too planned, too monumental. So a story was invented, a lost race, a vanished civilization of mysterious mound builders who came before the Indians, built these wonders, and then disappeared or were wiped out. Take a hard look at what that story does. If a lost, superior race built the mounds, then the native people living there weren't the descendants of great civilizations. They were latecomers, squatters on someone else's ruins. And if they were squatters, then taking the land from them wasn't really taking anything at all. The myth of the vanished mound builders wasn't harmless folklore, it was useful. It ran alongside removal, it ran alongside dispossession. It gave a moral alibi to a land grab. The lie about the past helped justify the theft in the present. That is the first thing buried at Cahokia, not a body. The truth about the builders. It took the federal government's own scientists to dig it out. In the late 1800s, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology put a researcher named Cyrus Thomas on the problem. Thomas started as a believer in the lost race. He ended as its executioner. His teams surveyed mound after mound, gathered the physical evidence, and the evidence said one thing over and over. The mounds were built by the ancestors of the native peoples who were still there. There was no vanished race. There never had been. The myth was demolished. The scientific record was corrected. But a corrected record and a corrected culture are two different things. The lie had already done its work. It had already shaped what people were willing to see. And even after the science moved, the silence stayed. The city didn't return to the national story it deserved. It just sat there, under Illinois grass, waiting. So now we can finally ask the real question. Once you accept who built Cahokia, and you look at what they built, you're left with something much harder. Why did they leave? Because they did leave. That's not in dispute. The city rose, blazed, and emptied. And when you look at how fast it rose, the leaving gets stranger. For a long time, the assumption was that a place like Cahokia grew the way cities usually grow. Slowly, A village becomes a town, becomes a center over centuries of drift. Gradual, organic. The dirt didn't support that. The archaeologist, most associated with reading Cahokia's beginning, Timothy Pawcatat, argued something far more dramatic. Cahokia didn't creep into existence. It exploded. Around the year 1050, in what he called a Big Bang, the site transformed almost overnight in archaeological terms. Massive construction. A reorganized landscape. Neighborhoods laid out. Populations pulled in from across the region, fast. This wasn't a slow accumulation. It looked like an event, a founding, almost a movement. Something happened, some idea or belief or political vision, powerful enough to make thousands of people converge on one floodplain and start hauling earth. And that should unsettle you, because cities are not supposed to appear like that. Not without writing, not without metal, not without wheels or draft animals to move the loads. Everything we associate with rapid urban construction, Cahokia did without. It built a metropolis with baskets and belief. But here's the thing about anything that rises that fast. It can fall the same way. A city that assembles itself in a generation is not resting on centuries of deep roots. It's resting on whatever pulled it together in the first place. And if that thing breaks, there's nothing underneath to hold. That's the shape of the mystery. Something summoned this place into being with astonishing speed, and a few centuries later, something let it go. And then, beneath one of its mounds, excavators found something that killed the peaceful farmer's picture forever. The mound is called Mound 72. It doesn't look like much from the outside. Small, ridge-shaped. But when Melvin Fowler and his team went into it in the 1960s, what came out changed how anyone could talk about Cahokia. Bodies, hundreds of them, not scattered, not random, arranged. There was one burial that got a name of its own, the beaded burial. 2 central individuals, and beneath and around them, a layer of tens of thousands of shell beads shaped into what may have been a bird, a falcon, or a hawk figure spread across the ground. Around that centerpiece, more bodies. And in other parts of the mound, mass graves, rows of young women buried together in numbers, groups of people who showed signs they didn't die of natural causes at all. The reading that most researchers reached is hard to say out loud. Human sacrifice, retainer death, people killed to accompany the powerful into the ground. Some of the mass burials appear to hold individuals who were dispatched deliberately as part of a ceremony, as part of a display of power. Now, be careful here, because the details are genuinely debated. Who exactly these people were, whether every mass grave means the same thing, how much was sacrifice versus reburial versus something we don't fully understand. Archaeologists still argue over the specifics, and they should. But strip it down to what the evidence won't let you deny, and you get this. Cahokia was not a gentle village of farmers minding their corn. It was a society with structure sharp enough and authority concentrated enough that some people could command the deaths of others and stage it in the earth. That's not a commune. That's a state, or something close to it. Hierarchy, ideology, power with the reach to take life and turn it into ritual. And a society organized that tightly, with that much invested in itself, does not usually just wander off. So what broke it? For a long time, the field had an answer it liked very much. And the reason it liked the answer tells you almost as much as the answer itself. The story went like this. Cahokia got too big for its own good. Too many people packed into the floodplain. And all those people needed wood. Wood for houses, wood for the enormous palisade walls, wood for fires, wood for the thousands of posts the city consumed. So they cut, and cut, and cut down the forests on the bluffs and slopes around the valley. And when you strip the trees off the high ground, the story continued. The soil has nothing to hold it. Rain washes it down. Erosion accelerates. Creeks and rivers silt up and swell. Floods come more often and hit harder. Crops drown. The floodplain that fed the city turns on it. In other words, they did it to themselves. Overpopulation, deforestation, erosion, flooding, collapse. A civilization that consumed its own foundation and paid for it. Now feel why that story was so comfortable. It's tidy, it's self-contained. Cause and effect, all inside the city walls. No messy external forces you can't measure. And it flatters us. It comes preloaded with a moral. Look at the ancient people who destroyed their environment. Learn from them. Don't repeat their mistake. It turns an entire civilization into a cautionary bumper sticker. A story that clean, that useful, that quotable, spreads. It gets into books. It gets into documentaries. It becomes the thing everybody knows. And a story everybody knows is a story almost nobody rechecks. The ecocide model settled in and got comfortable. It was never inconvenient enough to make anyone go back to the mud and test whether the flood layer it required was actually there, until someone did. The person who went back to look was an archaeologist named Caitlin Rankin, working with colleagues on the sediments around Cahokia in research that came together around 2021. The idea was straightforward. If the deforestation flooding story is true, the ground should show it. Strip the trees and you get a signature. Erosion, slope wash, sediment dumped and layered where the floods were supposed to have hit, especially near the mounds, where all that catastrophic runoff should have piled up. So they dug where the damage was supposed to be. They looked at the stratigraphy, the stacked layers of soil that record what happened and when, and the signature wasn't there. The ground below the site was stable. The layers didn't show the burst of erosion and flooding the theory demanded. The catastrophic self-inflicted flood, the smoking gun of the whole ecocide narrative, left no smoke. Sit with how strange that is. For decades, the accepted explanation for one of the great abandonments in North American history rested on an event the sediment simply doesn't record. The theory was clean. The mud wasn't. And this is where you see how a field actually works without needing to invent a single villain. Nobody hid anything. Nobody faked anything. The ecocide story survived as long as it did for the most human reason there is. It was satisfying, it was taught, it was repeated, and it was never uncomfortable enough to force a redig. Certainty doesn't need a conspiracy to protect itself. It just needs to be convenient. So if they didn't drown themselves, the pressure had to be coming from somewhere else, something outside the city. And there's a way to measure something that sounds impossible to measure. You can measure the people, not their bones, their waste. When humans live somewhere in large numbers, they leave a chemical fingerprint in the ground and in the sediment of nearby lakes. Specific molecules called fecal stanols, produced in the human gut, wash into the water and settle into the mud in layers year after year. The more people, the stronger the signal. Pull a core from the lake bottom, read the layers like a barcode, and you get something extraordinary. A population curve. A graph of roughly how many people were there, century by century. A team, including researchers like A.J. White and Cecil Schroeder, did exactly that, coring the lakes near Cahokia and reading the stanol record. And the curve tells the story of a city. It rises. Around that 11th century Big Bang, the human signal climbs hard, matching the explosion of construction. It holds. And then, well before any Europeans set foot anywhere near the continent, it falls. The population drains out of the floodplain, layer by layer, until the great city is a memory in the mud. This is what makes the approach so hard to wave away. Pottery styles can be argued about, house counts can be debated, but this measures people directly, chemically, in a sealed record laid down at the time. It's not somebody's interpretation of an artifact. It's a signature of bodies, and it says a real population really left. The proxy has limits, and honest researchers say so. It doesn't give you a precise census. It won't tell you exactly how many thousands at the peak, but the shape is undeniable. Rise, plateau, decline, a living city becoming an empty one. And when you line that decline up against the climate record, the timing stops feeling like coincidence, because the sky was turning against them. Look at what the environmental records around the same window show. Signs of drought pressing on the region, a broader climate shift, part of the larger cooling and drying that reshaped a lot of the northern hemisphere in these centuries. And a Mississippi that was becoming less reliable, more erratic, swinging toward heavier, harder to predict flooding, the kind that comes from a changing climate rather than from a city cutting its own trees. Now think about what Cahokia actually was. It was a machine for producing and storing surplus, corn mostly, enormous agricultural output feeding tens of thousands of people who weren't farming full-time, and on top of that surplus sat everything else. The mound building, the ceremonies, the specialists, the authority that could command a sacrifice. All of it paid for, ultimately, in food. A city like that isn't fragile because it's poor. It's fragile because it's leveraged. It has bet everything on abundance continuing. And the moment the abundance flickers, the whole structure feels it. Bad harvest after bad harvest. A flood that ruins the fields in the wrong year. A drought that thins the surplus that the entire social order depends on. That's not a statistic. That's a family in a neighborhood on the edge of the floodplain, watching the corn fail again, doing the math, and deciding not to stay for another year of it. And then the family next door, and the one after that. Not a single catastrophe. A slow bleed of people who each, individually, made the reasonable choice to leave. But here's the thing weather alone can't explain. When you look at Cahokia and its later phases, the city isn't just thinning, it's arming itself. Around the year 1200, they built a wall. Not a garden fence, a massive palisade, a defensive stockade of thousands of heavy logs wrapping around the central precinct, the heart of the city with Monk's Mound and the plaza. And they didn't build it once. They rebuilt it more than once over the following decades. You do not sink that much labor and that much scarce timber into a wall unless you are afraid of something. So who were they afraid of? That's where it gets genuinely uncertain and worth being honest about. The wall could point outward toward hostile neighbors, toward raiding, toward a region that was becoming more violent as resources tightened. Or it could point inward toward a city coming apart at the seams, factions, rival groups, a population that no longer trusted the center that ruled it. The cautious reading is that it's probably some mixture and that we can't fully separate the threats. But notice what even the cautious reading implies. Late Cahokia was a stressed place, a place investing enormous effort in defense at exactly the time its population was starting to slide, a place where the threat may not have only been the river or the drought. It may have been each other. And that points at something the ecocide story completely missed. Because Cahokia wasn't only an economy, it wasn't only mounds and corn and walls, it was a belief. Remember the Big Bang? A city doesn't assemble itself out of a floodplain in a generation because of good soil. Something has to pull those thousands of people in and hold them. And more, the evidence suggests that something was religious, a worldview, a ceremonial order powerful enough to organize a whole society. You can see it written into the ground far beyond the main city. There's a site out east of Cahokia called Emerald, the Emerald Acropolis, a ceremonial center along what appears to have been a processional route, a pilgrimage road leading toward the great city. And when researchers, Pocketat among them, studied how the mounds and structures there were laid out, they found something that doesn't happen by chance. Alignments to the moon, not the sun, which would be easy. The moon, whose rising and setting points on the horizon wander through a slow, complicated cycle that takes about 18 and a half years to complete. To align your architecture to the moon's extremes, you have to watch the sky for decades, understand the pattern, and then encode it in earth and timber. That's not chaos. That's not a society blundering toward collapse. That's precision, planning, a cosmology built into the landscape itself. Emerald looks like a place people travel to, a sacred node in an engineered spiritual geography with Cahokia at its center. And that changes what collapse even means here. Because if what held Cahokia together was partly a belief system, a shared religious and political vision that could move Earth and command lives, then the thing that could destroy it wasn't only flood or drought or famine, it was disillusionment. Think about what strings this together. A city summoned by an idea, sacrifices that display the power of that idea, a whole ceremonial landscape encoding it in the moon, and then, a couple of centuries later, drought and flooding chip at the surplus, the harvests fail, the floods don't cooperate, and the leaders whose authority rested on keeping the cosmic order working suddenly can't deliver. The rains don't come when they're supposed to, the river doesn't behave. What happens to a religious political capital when the gods and the rulers who speak for them stop delivering? People stop believing, and when they stop believing, the thing that pulled them in stops holding them. The walls go up as the trust breaks down, and then, family by family, they leave. When a belief breaks, the people scatter. And that is exactly what they did. Here is the fact that reframes everything, the one that should stop you cold. Cahokia was effectively empty by around 1350 to 1400. Now do the arithmetic on that date. Columbus reaches the Caribbean in 1992. Europeans don't push into the mid-continent, don't reach this stretch of the Mississippi in any real way until well after that, which means the greatest city north of Mexico was already a ghost, already grass-covered and abandoned, a full century or more before a single European was anywhere close. This wasn't conquest, there was no army. This wasn't the great wave of colonial disease that would later devastate so many native nations, because that wave hadn't arrived yet. Not here, not at Cahokia. The city died on its own schedule, for its own reasons, before the ships. That alone makes it different from almost every collapse story people think they know, and it kills every attempt to reduce it to one cause. It wasn't just deforestation. We've seen the mud refuse that. It wasn't just drought, because plenty of societies survive drought. It wasn't just the flooding, or just the internal violence, or just the loss of faith. It was all of it, converging. Climate stress squeezing the surplus, a less reliable river drowning the margin, political fracture and defensive fear, and a belief system that couldn't hold once it stopped delivering on its promises. Not a bang, a drain. There was no invasion, no plague on the record, just a city that ran out of reasons to stay together and slowly, deliberately walked away from itself. But even that isn't the strangest part. The strangest part is what the people who left didn't carry with them. When you look at the native nations of the region in the centuries after Cahokia, the descendants of the people who built and abandoned it, something is missing. There's remarkably little in the way of strong, specific oral tradition that says, we built the greatest city on the continent, and here is why we left it. The memory of Cahokia as Cahokia is faint, diffuse, in some ways almost turned away from. Be careful here, because this is contested and sensitive ground. Oral traditions are real and rich and were often not shared with the outsiders who came asking, and absence of a recorded memory is not the same as absence of memory. We should not overstate what we know about what descendant communities did or didn't remember, but the pattern that many researchers have noticed is striking. It's as if, when people left, they didn't just leave the place, they left the idea. Dispersed into new nations, new arrangements, new ways of organizing themselves that looked deliberately unlike the hierarchical, sacrifice-commanding, mound-building order they'd walked out of. As if the abandonment wasn't only physical, as if it was a turning away from a system that had failed them. And into that silence, centuries later, the settlers walked. Into that gap where a clear, loud, national memory of Cahokia might have been, they poured the mound builder myth, the lie about the vanished race, the story that erased the builders entirely. Look at the shape of that. First, the city empties itself. Then history denies who made it, a double burial, the place, and then the truth about the place. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you, because it's the part with no villain and no conspiracy, and it's worse for exactly that reason. Nobody had to organize any of it. No secret meeting decided to bury Cahokia's builders. A convenient prejudice did one half of the work, and a comfortable story did the other. The myth of the lost race erased the makers. The myth of ecological suicide flattened the ending into a lesson. Both were tidy, both were useful, both were wrong, and both survived for the same ordinary dangerous reason. They were easier than the truth, which brings us all the way back to that soil core, pulled from the mud, holding a flood layer that isn't there. So let's be honest about where the ground actually leaves us and separate what we know from what we're still fighting about. Here is what the evidence firmly holds. Cahokia was real, and it was enormous, the largest city north of Mexico, built entirely by the ancestors of Native Americans, by hand. It rose with shocking speed around 1050. Mound 72 shows a society with power concentrated enough to stage death as ritual. And it was abandoned, on its own, by roughly 1400, a century or more before any European contact could explain it. Here is what is still genuinely debated: the exact peak population, the precise weight of each pressure, how much was drought, how much was flooding, how much was politics, how much was broken belief, what the palisade was really defending against, what descendant communities did and didn't carry forward. That argument is alive, and it should be. And here is what has quietly lost ground: the clean, comfortable morality tale version, the one where they cut down their forests and drowned themselves in a self-inflicted flood, the one everyone was taught. When someone finally went back and dug where the flood was supposed to be, the flood wasn't there. But notice how that story lost. There was no press conference, no apology, no textbook publisher announcing they'd gotten it wrong for 50 years. That's not how these things go. The old model didn't collapse. It retreated. It got repeated a little less. The language around it got softer, more hedged. New papers ruled it out and moved on. The bold claim that they destroyed their own environment quietly became they may have contributed to environmental stress, which became just one factor among several, which became a thing you stopped mentioning. The map didn't burn. It changed shape while no one was looking. And that's the real lesson here, and it's not the one on the bumper sticker. The lesson isn't that an ancient people were foolish. The old timeline wasn't foolish either. It was built from the evidence people had and shaped by the stories people found easy to believe. That's the danger. Not lies. Comfort. A clean story becomes the taught story becomes the career, and changing it starts to feel like an attack instead of a correction. The tidy version of Cahokia was too small, too clean, too flattering, and it survived not because it was true, but because for a long time nobody needed it not to be. So the question that should keep you up isn't really about one abandoned city in Illinois. It's this: if the neatest, most repeated, most taught explanation for the greatest city in ancient North America failed the moment somebody pushed a tube into the ground and actually looked, then how much of the rest of the deep American past is still sitting comfortably in books, mislabeled, oversimplified, waiting for someone to dig where the story says they shouldn't have to? Picture it one more time: a core of dark earth sliding up out of the mud beside Monk's Mound, Under a low moon that 1,000 years ago someone here watched carefully enough to build into the land. The layer that was supposed to end the argument. Silent, refusing to confirm the story it was named for. And above it, the greatest city north of Mexico. Still there. Still enormous. Still under the Illinois grass. Not lost. Never really lost. Just waiting for us to stop telling ourselves the easy version and finally listen to the ground.